Several states have decided to end the federal unemployment supplement, stating that some employers are complaining that they can't find workers for their jobs. And when I think about this decision by these politicians in these states, I believe they are making a grave mistake because we are not out of the woods as related to this pandemic and as related to the workplace. This is not going to force or coerce people to come back to the workplace, ending these federal unemployment benefits as supplements, because most workers aren't really thinking about going back to the workplace just yet. Now, America's workplace is majority women these days, and many of those women aren't going back to the workplace because many don't have childcare and many don't have a place to put their small children, and school has not opened. So, ending the unemployment benefits supplement is not really going to get those women to come back to the workplace the way many of these employers would like them to do. All it's going to do is exacerbate an already bad situation where half the country is still unemployed. Yes, there are quite a few fast food and service jobs that can't be seem to be filled, but what many politicians don't seem to understand is many of these jobs are not able to be filled because most of these work environments have become extremely toxic over the last 2 decades. Now, ever since the recession of 9/11, the workplace has changed, and ever since the aftermath of that IT boom going bust, we've seen a workplace where employees don't have the leverage, but employers have had the leverage for the last 20 years. And because the employer has had the leverage over the last 20 years, they have really gotten complacent about the way they hire people. And instead of the workplace becoming an interdependent environment, the workplace is becoming an extremely codependent environment. And this codependent environment has become extremely hostile to the worker because the employer has had so much leverage, they believe it is within their right to practically abuse workers in the workplace. And because most women in the workplace have most of the jobs, most of these women are willing to tolerate and accept abuse until the COVID 19 pandemic came around. Because before the COVID 19 pandemic, we had many women in the workplace, and because they were there, they were willing to tolerate things like employers imposing erratic work hours in a schedule where a worker might work 8 hours one day and 12 hours the next, or they may work crazy hours starting at 6:30 in the morning and then finishing their job at 6:30 at night one day, and then get up again the next day at 9 o'clock to end their day at 5 o'clock. So these erratic hours were something that females would tolerate, but erratic hours have an effect on people's mental health. And erratic hours is a very frustrating thing to deal with. And many people now are really rethinking going back to a workplace where they have to deal with these erratic hours where there is no consistency in a schedule, so a person can plan the rest of their day or even try to go out here and start things like side hustles or small businesses, or even enjoy a nice weekend to themselves, because with these erratic hours, a person can't even have a Saturday off because employers want to have this extremely inconsistent, so-called flexible schedule, but that doesn't really allow people consistent hours to have their own lives. And that's one of the things that frustrates a lot of workers these days, is those erratic hours. The other thing that really frustrates them are these really unbearable and untenable work conditions, because as our economy has contracted over the last 20 years, many employers are trying to get one person to do the job of 4 or 5 people that and that's really frustrating a lot of people because these employers, they want you to do all of these different tasks in a day, and what they also want to do is compound unrealistic and ridiculous expectations on workers, and many workers are really frustrated about having to not only deal with these erratic and inconsistent hours, but also having to deal with expectations that don't even match reality as related to a business model, and then being blamed for failures that management goes out here and imposes on the workers. So a lot of workers out here, they're really tired of these crazy work conditions, and they're also tired of these really abusive bosses. So you have a work environment again with erratic hours, really unrealistic expectations, and then you have a boss who, instead of trying to provide you with support, is verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, passive aggressive, and even in some cases manipulative. And many people don't really see an incentive to going back to these workplaces, especially when you consider that many of these workplaces pay people really low wages, because in today's workplace a lot of workers were willing to take lower wages over the last 20 years due to the 9/11 recession and the Great Recession of 2008, just to have a way to pay their bills and keep a roof over their heads. And they were willing to tolerate this codependent work environment just because the economy wasn't doing well at the time. But the COVID-19 pandemic derailed that train because many Americans were just, they were able to actually be able to breathe because they were given this unemployment and this federal supplement, and that allowed them to actually have enough money to not only pay their bills, but in some cases have enough money to be able to save some money and be able to go out here and breathe. And this, in addition to having all of that time off to rest their minds and not deal with the stresses of a workplace where it's extremely erratic, extremely hostile, and extremely abusive. A lot of Americans got a little bit of peace, and they were able to start really thinking critically about their future. And as many Americans started really thinking about their future, they were really thinking that, was it really worth it to go back to some of these service jobs where they go out here and are harassed by their bosses and then harassed by the customer and attacked and verbally abused by the customer? That's the critical question many Americans started to ask themselves about the workplace as they were sitting there at these jobs, and they were just thinking to themselves, if I've got this time, I've got time to reassess my life and reassess some of the decisions I've made about my life. So you have employers now that things are opening up. They're looking for workers to return to the workplace, and they're thinking that, the workers are going to come back to the workplace and back to that codependent environment where they had all the leverage, but most people aren't coming back to the workplace because they feel like there's no reason to come back to a workplace and have to deal with all of this verbal abuse, this emotional abuse, and personal attacks from the customers. I mean, a lot of these service workers dealt with a lot during the pandemic, and now many of these workers are rethinking their lives and rethinking things because they've gotten through this pandemic, and now they're realizing that life is short, just like the people in 9/11. When 9/11 ended, you saw a lot of people going back to college and getting their masters and their PhDs because they wanted to go out here and have better careers. And I believe the same thing is happening right now as related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And many of these service businesses, they have been caught unawares as related to how this has really affected the psyche of the American people, who really realize that working in a codependent environment for years just isn't worth it because they aren't growing, their lives aren't really moving forward, And you can't really force people to take jobs that they don't want because the work conditions are absolutely unbearable. That's the main reason why many are walking away. And many of the women, about 3 million to 2 million of them, are walking away and not coming back. And this is what's got many employers actually scared, because they used to hire the women to be able to depress the wages, but they can't find women to hire, and now they have to deal with the 8 million plus men out here who have been unemployed, like myself, since the Great Recession. And that's got a lot of these employers upset, because they know that if the men come back to the workforce, then those wages are going to go up. And the women themselves, they're not coming back because, again, they don't have the child care. The schools aren't open. And many just don't want to come back because they had spent an entire year dealing with practically a combat type situation where they had to be verbally abused about telling people to wear masks, having to deal with people attacking them for social distancing, dealing with the tension and stress of being in these retail businesses in a very tense time. So a lot of people don't have an incentive to come back to these jobs. And these women, again, have been through all this, and they're sitting there saying, oh, we can't find anybody. But again, they don't want to look at the people like myself who have been looking for work, because I have put in applications in many of these businesses during the pandemic, and I oftentimes got the form rejection response from stores like Target, and some stores I never heard from again. So I, again, have to look at this whole statement that they're making. Oh, people aren't really wanting to work. But the thing is that when I look at it, it's like many employers, it's, again, like I said in the previous video, they're trying to be picky, and they're thinking that they've got the leverage, and they're trying to have the leverage once again. But you don't have the leverage anymore, because people, in many cases, many of the women you tried to bring into the workplace, they're burnt out. Many of the women you tried to are trying to coerce in the workplace, they're not hearing you anymore. And many of the men out here, they want to work, but you don't want to work with them because you don't want to pay them. And many of the black men who want to work, you don't want to work with them because you don't think that black men can go out here and do a job. And many of these politicians, they're thinking, oh, if I end this unemployment, I will be able to force people to go back to work. But many people just don't want to work in these part-time fast food and part-time retail jobs. No, most Americans want full-time jobs where they can get full benefits and be paid a decent wage, and they want to go to a work environment where they have stable hours and stable work conditions and are working for people who will treat them with dignity and respect. And you can't really force people after they've been through a great trauma like the COVID-19 pandemic to go back to a codependent, emotionally abusive work environment, because many of those people, they've already been through a lot. Many people have lost family members due to this virus. Many people have family members who have suffered due to this pandemic. And many of those people, they have no interest, after dealing with all of that stress, going back to a high-stress work environment around an extremely toxic, emotionally abusive bully who just goes out here and wants to just practically run people into the ground because they want to go out here and profit at another person's labor expense and wants to get them for the cheapest dollar that they can find. Those days, I believe, are over for many of these companies where they think they can go out here and find this really cheap labor, because most Americans are just saying they're tired of being abused by employers. And this was something that was out of left field for many of these corporate types who have practically enjoyed abusing workers for over 20 years. And the thing is, they don't really want to go out here again and deal with the men in the workforce, because those men would push back and those men would make demands insisting on getting stable work hours, getting benefits like health care, and getting stable work conditions where they could be treated humanely, because when you have to deal with a man, it's different than a woman. And that's why they're trying to coerce the woman to go back to these service jobs. But the women just don't want to go back because they realize that they have nested, and that's a part of female behavior. And now that they have nested, they don't want to leave their nests. But you have politicians trying to force them back, and this is going to backfire on them, because when you have, again, a country that has not really recovered from an economic fall like this COVID-19 pandemic, and you try to force people to go back to work, those people may be forced to vote against these politicians who implement these policies. Now, if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to see me talk about more issues like this, you can again donate to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App. And if you want to pick up some of my books on the SJS Direct imprint and allow me to continue staying on the air, you can pick up books like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and my nonfiction books like The Man Crisis on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.